Imagine you're a Mongol warrior in the 13th century. You're standing in line at the quartermaster's tent, receiving your military equipment. One by one, they hand you the tools of war: a composite bow, 60 arrows, a curved sword, leather armor, a lance, a battle axe, all the deadly instruments you'll need to conquer half the known world. And then they hand you something else: a pair of silk underwear. Wait, what? Silk underwear? In an all-male army? In the 13th century? When silk was one of the most expensive materials on Earth, worth more than gold by weight in some places? You might think, did Genghis Khan want his soldiers to be comfortable? Fashionable? Was this some kind of luxury perk? But here's the thing. Genghis Khan wasn't known for being soft. He wasn't known for pampering his troops with unnecessary luxuries. This was a man whose armies had a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. So why silk underwear? The answer isn't what you think, and it reveals one of the most brilliant military innovations in history, one that saved thousands of lives and gave the Mongols a massive advantage that their enemies never understood. Today we're going to talk about battlefield medicine, the surprising physics of silk, and how a piece of undergarment changed the course of warfare. This is the story of why Genghis Khan's greatest weapon might have been worn under his soldiers' pants. Before we get to the silk underwear, let's talk about just how organized and sophisticated the Mongol military was. Contrary to the popular image of barbarian hordes, the Mongol army was one of the most disciplined and well-organized fighting forces in history. Genghis Khan organized his entire military using a decimal system. Everything was based on units of 10. Arban, 10 soldiers. Jagun, 100 soldiers, 10 Arbans. Mingan, 1,000 soldiers, 10 Jaguns. Tumen, 10,000 soldiers, 10 Mingans. This wasn't just administrative convenience. This structure enabled orders to be transmitted quickly and clearly through the chain of command. If a Tumen commander gave an order, it would cascade down through exactly 4 levels to reach every single soldier. And here's the brutal part. The system enforced collective responsibility. If one soldier in an Arban deserted or failed, the entire unit of 10 could be punished or executed. This created intense peer pressure and unit cohesion. Everyone was responsible for everyone else. Military service wasn't optional. Every male from age 14 and up had to serve. The only exceptions were doctors, government officials, and Buddhist monks. That's it. And here's what's remarkable. Each soldier was responsible for his own equipment. When you joined the army, you had to bring 4 to 5 good horses, your own weapons, your own supplies. The army conducted regular inspections. If your equipment wasn't up to standard, you were kicked out, dishonorably discharged and sent home in shame. Think about the pressure that creates. You're not just representing yourself. You're representing your entire unit, your family, your tribe. So what did a Mongol soldier carry? A lot. Weapons. A composite bow with at least 60 arrows. Light cavalry carried a short sword and 2 to 3 javelins. Heavy cavalry carried a curved saber, a mace, a battle axe, and a 4-meter lance. That's over 13 feet long for reference. Armor. Light cavalry wore a fitted coat. Heavy cavalry wore full armor, a chest plate, a wooden shield, and a helmet made of leather or iron, depending on rank. Supplies, equipment for horses, cooking utensils, dried meat, water, tools for sharpening arrows, needle and thread for repairing clothes, all carried in bags made from cow stomachs, which were waterproof, flexible, and would float if you dropped them in water. This was a mobile, self-sufficient fighting force. They didn't need supply lines like European armies. They carried everything they needed. But with all this equipment, all these weapons, all this armor, all these practical tools, why on earth would they also issue silk underwear? Seems like a strange priority, doesn't it? Let me tell you why it wasn't. Here's something most people don't know about ancient warfare. Most soldiers didn't die in battle. They died afterwards, from infections. Let me put this in perspective. In medieval warfare, for every soldier killed by a sword or spear, 2 or 3 more would die in the days and weeks following from infected wounds. No antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no antiseptics. just wounds that would fester, turn septic, and kill you slowly. And arrows were the worst. Here's why. When an arrow hits you, it doesn't just puncture your skin, it drives deep into your body, and then you have to get it out. Sounds simple, right? Just pull it out. Except it's not simple at all. Medieval arrowheads were designed to be devastating. They had barbs, little hooks or serrated edges that pointed backward. This design served a purpose. Once the arrow entered your body, those barbs would catch on tissue and muscle. The arrow would lodge firmly in place. Now imagine you're a battlefield medic in the 13th century. A soldier comes to you with an arrow in his shoulder. You need to remove it. You have two options. Option 1, pull it straight out. When you do this, those barbs act like fish hooks. As you pull, they tear through muscle, blood vessels, and tissue. A wound that was maybe 1 centimeter wide when the arrow went in becomes 3 or 4 centimeters wide when you pull it out. It's not a clean puncture anymore. It's a mangled, gaping hole. The soldier will likely bleed heavily. The wound is now much more vulnerable to infection. And the pain? Excruciating. Option 2, push it through. If the arrow didn't go in too deep, you might be able to push it all the way through the body and out the other side. Then you pull it out of the exit wound. But this means driving an arrowhead through several more inches of healthy tissue, creating a second wound, more trauma, more bleeding, more pain. Either way, the mortality rate was terrible. Let me give you a historical example. King Henry V of England was hit in the face with an arrow when he was 16 years old in 1403. The royal physician had to perform surgery, cutting into his face, using specially designed tongs to extract the arrowhead, bit by bit over the course of hours. Henry was lucky. He was royalty, so he had the best medical care available in the world at that time. He survived, but he carried the scar for the rest of his life. Most soldiers weren't so lucky. They didn't have royal physicians. They had battlefield medics with basic tools, working in unsanitary conditions with limited medical knowledge. For the average soldier, an arrow wound was often a death sentence. Not immediately, but a slow death over days or weeks as the wound became infected, fever set in, and sepsis took over. And this created a psychological problem too. Soldiers knew this. They understood that getting hit by an arrow, even if it didn't kill you instantly, meant you'd probably die anyway. And not a quick, honorable death in battle, but a slow, agonizing death in a medical tent. Burning with fever while your wound turned black and putrid. This fear affected morale. It made soldiers hesitate. It made them less effective in combat. So Genghis Khan's military had a problem. How do you keep soldiers alive when they get hit by arrows? Better armor? That helps prevent arrows from penetrating in the first place. But arrows can still find gaps. And heavier armor slows down cavalry, which defeats the whole purpose of the Mongol military strategy. Better doctors? Sure, but even the best doctors can't do much when removing an arrow causes catastrophic tissue damage. And then someone, we don't know exactly who, maybe a military physician, maybe someone who had experience with Chinese silk, realized something remarkable about the properties of silk fabric. Something that would change everything. Silk is one of the most extraordinary materials in nature. It's produced by silkworms, caterpillars that spin cocoons from a single continuous thread that can be over 3,000 feet long. That thread is made of a protein fiber that has some remarkable properties. First, it's incredibly strong. Pound for pound, silk is stronger than steel. A silk thread can support more weight relative to its thickness than a steel wire of the same diameter. Second, it's incredibly flexible and smooth. It doesn't irritate skin, it moves with your body. It's comfortable even in hot weather. Third, and this is the key, silk is very difficult to puncture cleanly. Let me explain what I mean. When you stab a piece of cotton or linen fabric with something sharp, the fibers break. The material tears. You get a hole with jagged edges. But silk behaves differently. The individual silk fibers are so strong and so smooth that when something sharp tries to penetrate them, they don't break easily. Instead, they slide around the penetrating object. The fabric deforms and wraps around whatever's piercing it. Think of it like this. If you try to stab through a cotton t-shirt with a knife, you'll punch right through. But if you try to stab through multiple layers of silk, the fabric tends to gather around the blade, creating a kind of cushion. Now here's where it gets brilliant. The Mongols, after conquering parts of China and gaining access to silk production, discovered that if a soldier wore silk underwear under his armor, something remarkable happened when he got hit by an arrow. Here's the sequence of events. Step 1. Arrow flies through the air at high speed. Step 2. Arrow penetrates the outer armor, leather or chainmail. Step 3. Arrow reaches the layer of silk underwear. Step 4. Instead of punching through the silk cleanly, the arrowhead pushes the silk fabric ahead of it. The silk wraps around the arrowhead as it enters the body. Step 5. The arrow drives into the flesh, but now the arrowhead is encased in a layer of silk fabric. What you end up with is an arrow wound where the arrowhead never directly touches the tissue. There's a silk barrier between the metal and the flesh. Now, why does this matter? Because when it's time to remove the arrow, instead of pulling on the arrow itself, you pull on the silk. The medic or the soldier himself would gently tug on the silk fabric surrounding the wound. The silk wrapped around the arrowhead would begin to pull the arrow out. Those barbs that would normally catch and tear tissue, they're catching on smooth silk instead. The arrow slides out much more easily. The wound doesn't get torn open. Less tissue damage, less bleeding, less trauma. And here's the crucial part. Less chance of infection. A smaller wound means fewer opportunities for dirt and bacteria to enter. The silk itself, being relatively clean and smooth, doesn't introduce contaminants the way rougher materials might. The soldier has a much better chance of survival. Let me give you some rough estimates based on historical patterns. Without silk underwear, maybe 50% of soldiers hit by arrows would die from subsequent infections. With silk underwear, that number might drop to 20–25%. You've just doubled your soldier's survival rate from arrow wounds with a piece of undergarment. Think about what this means strategically. In a battle where your side takes, say, 1,000 arrow wounds, you might expect 500 men to die without silk underwear. With it, maybe 200–250. You've just saved 250–300 trained, experienced warriors. Each one of those warriors represents years of training, expensive equipment, and irreplaceable battlefield experience. Saving their lives isn't just humane, it's economically and militarily smart. And there's a psychological benefit too. When soldiers know they have a much better chance of surviving an arrow wound, they fight with more confidence. Less fear means better performance in combat. So, yes, silk underwear was expensive, really expensive. But Genghis Khan did the math and realized it was worth it. Now you might be wondering, why specifically silk? Couldn't they use other materials? Great question. Let's compare. Cotton or linen. These plant fibers are much weaker than silk. They tear easily. When an arrowhead hits them, they just shred. They won't wrap around the arrowhead the way silk does. Not effective. Wool, stronger than cotton, but still not strong enough. Plus, wool is bulky and hot. Soldiers are riding horses all day in various climates. Wool underwear would be uncomfortable and impractical. Leather. Leather is tough, but it's stiff. It doesn't wrap around an arrowhead smoothly, and it's heavy. It would add too much weight and restrict movement. Heavy linen or canvas. You could make this thick enough to be strong, but then it becomes rigid and uncomfortable. A soldier needs to move freely, especially Mongol cavalry, who spend entire days on horseback performing acrobatic maneuvers. Only silk has the right combination of properties. Strong enough not to tear, smooth enough to wrap around arrowheads. Flexible enough to move with the body, light enough not to add significant weight, comfortable enough to wear all day. It's perfect for the purpose. Now let's talk about economics. Silk was expensive, really expensive. In medieval times, silk from China was worth more than its weight in gold in some European markets. Outfitting an entire army with silk underwear would cost a fortune. But here's the thing. Genghis Khan had just conquered parts of China. He controlled significant portions of the Silk Road. He had direct access to silk production at much lower costs than his European contemporaries. And he did a cost-benefit analysis. Cost of silk underwear per soldier. Expensive. maybe equivalent to a few months of a soldier's pay. Cost of training and equipping a replacement soldier, 10 plus years of training, plus equipment, plus the loss of an experienced warrior who knows how to fight in coordinated cavalry tactics. The silk was cheaper. It's like insurance. You pay a premium up front to protect a much more valuable asset. And unlike European kingdoms that had to import silk at exorbitant prices, the Mongols had access to the supply chain. They could manufacture or acquire silk underwear at a fraction of the cost their enemies would pay. This gave them an advantage their opponents couldn't easily copy, even if they knew about it. So here's an interesting question. If silk underwear was such a brilliant innovation, why didn't everyone copy it? Several reasons. First, they didn't know about it. Underwear is, by definition, worn under your clothes, under your armor. It's not visible. An enemy soldier doesn't see it in battle. Even captured Mongol soldiers might not explain the full reasoning behind it. European chroniclers wrote about the Mongols extensively. They described their tactics, their weapons, their horses, but underwear? That's not exactly something that gets mentioned in military reports. So most of the Mongols' enemies simply didn't know this trick existed. Second, even if they knew, they couldn't afford it. Remember, silk had to be imported into Europe from Asia at enormous cost. The expense of outfitting even a small army with silk underwear would be prohibitive. A European king might be able to afford silk underwear for himself, and indeed, wealthy nobility did wear silk. But for common soldiers, out of the question. The Mongols had a geographic and economic advantage here that couldn't be easily replicated. Third, different military priorities. European medieval armies focused heavily on armor, heavy plate armor, chainmail. The idea was, if you can prevent the arrow from penetrating in the first place, you don't need to worry about removing it. This philosophy led to increasingly heavy armor, which required bigger horses, which moved more slowly, which created a completely different style of warfare. The Mongols took a different approach. Lighter, more mobile cavalry that could move quickly and shoot arrows while riding. They accepted that some arrows would get through, and they focused on treating wounds effectively rather than preventing them entirely. Neither approach is necessarily better. They're just different strategic choices based on different circumstances. Fourth, cultural factors. In the European military culture of the time, wounded soldiers were often left on the battlefield. Medical care was minimal. The attitude was more, soldiers who get seriously wounded will probably die anyway, so why invest resources in trying to save them? The Mongols had a more pragmatic view. Every trained warrior is valuable. If you can save them, you should. It's worth the investment. This difference in mindset meant that even if European commanders knew about the silk underwear trick, they might not have seen it as a priority worth the cost. The silk underwear wasn't the only medical innovation in the Mongol army. It was part of a broader system. The Mongols had dedicated medical personnel, doctors who traveled with military units. These weren't just random people with some first aid knowledge. They were trained professionals, exempt from regular combat duties so they could focus on treating the wounded. Medical supplies were stored in separate tents, away from the main military encampment. When a soldier needed treatment, he could go there immediately and receive care. Soldiers were also taught basic first aid. If you got hit with an arrow and there was no doctor immediately available, you knew the procedure. Gently pull on the silk around the wound. Extract the arrow. Apply pressure to stop bleeding. Get to a medic. This systematic approach to battlefield medicine was far ahead of its time. Compare this to European armies of the same period. European forces had few dedicated doctors. Medical care was haphazard. Wounded soldiers were often left where they fell until after the battle, and many died from treatable injuries simply because no one was taking care of them. The Mongols understood something that wouldn't become standard military practice in Europe for centuries. Taking care of wounded soldiers is a strategic advantage. If you can return wounded soldiers to fighting condition, you maintain a larger effective force. You don't have to constantly train new recruits to replace dead veterans. Your army gets more experienced over time instead of less experienced. It seems obvious in hindsight, but it was revolutionary at the time. So what's the legacy of Mongol silk underwear? Well, the specific practice died out with the Mongol Empire. Once firearms became dominant on the battlefield, arrows became less relevant, and the silk underwear trick wasn't needed anymore. But the principles behind it live on. Modern body armor, today's military body armor, Kevlar vests, for example, is based on a similar concept to silk. Kevlar is made from synthetic fibers that are incredibly strong and difficult to puncture. When a bullet hits Kevlar, the fibers absorb and distribute the impact, preventing or reducing penetration. The principle is the same. Use strong, flexible fibers to protect against projectiles and reduce injury. In fact, scientists have studied natural silk extensively as a potential material for body armor. Spider silk, in particular, is being researched for protective applications because of its remarkable strength-to-weight ratio. Battlefield medicine. Every modern military has a sophisticated medical corps. Combat medics are trained to provide immediate care on the battlefield. Helicopter medevac gets wounded soldiers to hospitals within minutes. Tourniquets, pressure bandages, and quick clot agents minimize blood loss. All of this stems from the same principle the Mongols understood. If you want to win wars, you need to keep your soldiers alive. The economics of military medicine. The U.S. military spends billions on medical care for service members. Is it expensive? Absolutely, but it's worth it because a trained soldier represents an enormous investment. Saving lives saves money in the long run. Genghis Khan figured this out 800 years ago. So what can we learn from this story? First, innovation isn't always about inventing something new. The Mongols didn't invent silk. Silk had existed for thousands of years before them, but they found a novel application, using it as a medical device to improve battlefield survivability. Sometimes the best innovations come from taking something that already exists and using it in a completely new way. In business, in technology, in life, you don't always need to create something from scratch. Sometimes you just need to look at existing tools and think, what else could this be used for? Second, investing in people pays off. Genghis Khan could have saved money by not issuing silk underwear. In the short term, it would have been cheaper. But he understood that his soldiers were his most valuable asset. Protecting them, even at significant cost, was worth it because it preserved the fighting capability of his army. This applies today. Companies that invest in their employees, good health care, good working conditions, training and development, might spend more in the short term. But they retain talented people longer, build institutional knowledge, and ultimately perform better. Taking care of people isn't just ethical, it's strategic. Third, small details can have huge impacts. Who would think that underwear could change the outcome of battles? But it did. By reducing death rates from arrow wounds, the Mongols maintained larger, more experienced armies. This contributed to their success in conquering the largest contiguous empire in history. Never dismiss something as just a detail. Sometimes details matter more than the big obvious things. Fourth, think beyond the immediate problem. Most medieval armies focused on preventing wounds, thicker armor, better shields. The Mongols thought, what happens after someone gets wounded? They didn't just think about the battle itself. They thought about the aftermath, the recovery, the long-term sustainability of their fighting force. In our lives, we often focus on immediate solutions. How do I avoid this problem? Sometimes the better question is, if the problem happens anyway, how do I minimize the damage? That's systems thinking, and it's powerful. So to answer our original question, why did Genghis Khan issue silk underwear to his all-male army? Not because he was soft, not because he wanted his soldiers to be fashionable, not because he didn't understand military priorities. He did it because he was a strategic genius who understood that war isn't just about fighting. It's about logistics, medicine, and taking care of your most valuable assets, your people. Silk underwear saved lives. It kept experienced warriors in the field. It gave the Mongols a medical advantage their enemies didn't have and couldn't easily copy. It was a force multiplier hidden underneath layers of leather armor. And it all came down to understanding the properties of a material and thinking creatively about how to use it. The strongest armies aren't necessarily the ones with the biggest weapons or the bravest soldiers. Sometimes they're the ones who pay attention to what's happening under the surface, the ones who think about what comes after the battle, the ones that invest in keeping their people alive. Genghis Khan understood that 800 years ago. Maybe we should too. If you enjoyed this deep dive into military innovation and the surprising importance of underwear in medieval warfare, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about how small details change history. And let me know in the comments, what's a small detail in your life or work that turned out to be way more important than you expected? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.